Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on when you're listening to this. The goal of this video is to provide you with some tools that should help you effectively write learning objectives and use those to make your teaching sessions better. First off, why should you do this? Why buy into writing learning objectives? Many of us have written them kind of grudgingly after we've given a presentation or after we've prepared something. I'd like to show you through this video that learning objectives actually are very helpful for focusing your teaching and for producing a good coherent teaching outcome. So first off, there are benefits for the learners. Do you remember back to when you were first learning, perhaps as a first-year medical student, there was so much information that was coming at you, it may have felt like you were drinking from a fire hose. The learners really don't have the sophistication necessary to sift through all of this information and figure out what's important. They have a difficult time trying to figure out where to focus their study efforts. So by writing learning objectives, you're clearly telling your learners what's the most important material and where they should focus their learning. There's also benefits for you as an instructor. It focuses your teaching. And if you write your learning objectives with the method that I'm going to talk about, it ensures that you'll have a coherent outcome, that at the end of your teaching session, they will have acquired some related sets of skills that enable them to be able to do something tangible. It limits the content that you teach as well. So often educators are asked to give a 1-hour lecture, we'll say, and the first thought is, gosh, what can I cover in an hour? And the tendency is to try and fit as much as you possibly can into that hour because you want to teach them as much as you can. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that they're actually learning all of that material. More isn't always better. Sometimes it's just more. So when you're getting started, the most important thing to remember is that you want to keep the focus on the learning. When you're planning a teaching session, put some time into thinking about what do you want your learners to be able to do when they leave your teaching session, or what skills do you want them to have acquired as a result of your teaching session. And then you want to write that down. And by writing that down, you've now written down the core objective for your session, your overall goal. Once you've defined your overall goal, then you have to stop and think about, well, gosh, what do they need to be able to learn in order to achieve the core objective? What smaller pieces of information do they have to acquire so that they can put it together to achieve my goal for them? You write down these smaller bits of knowledge as your supporting objectives. So for a 1-hour teaching session, you generally need between 3 and 5 supporting objectives. These supporting objectives, think of them as smaller bits of material that the trainee needs in order to put all of this together to achieve the core objective. I want to stop for a minute and mention something about learning hierarchy. The objectives that we set for our learners, they vary in complexity. They're not all equal, from the simplest, which is pure recall, memorizing something without necessarily understanding it, to the most complex, which might be creating something new, or synthesis. Because these learning objectives are not all equal, a categorization scheme has been developed to organize them, and this is called Bloom's taxonomy. So this scheme is designed on the premise that successful learning at higher or more complex levels of cognitive skills relies upon first learning information at lower levels of cognitive skill. So at the base of this pyramid is the most simple and basic learning objective, which is acquiring knowledge. Pure memorization or listing or recalling something. You can list or know something without actually understanding it. So comprehension is a little bit more complex. It involves being able to demonstrate that you understand something or discussing something. More complex than that is application, taking that information, that knowledge that you've gained and applying it to a new situation, and so on and so forth. The higher levels on the Bloom's pyramid are more complicated. So now let's apply this to this concept I've mentioned of core and supporting objectives. When you're creating a teaching session, your core objective should be from the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. As a result of your teaching session, you want them to be able to do something more sophisticated. Your supporting objectives typically will be from the lower cognitive levels of Bloom's taxonomy. They first have to learn something and understand it before they can apply it or analyze it. Learning objectives can also help you to plan a good teaching session. And here's what I mean by that. For each of the learning objectives, each of the supporting objectives that you write, You'll need to decide how that objective is going to be taught, and you want to write that down. Now, historically, this wasn't necessary back 20 years ago when pretty much everything was taught by a lecture. But now we can be a lot more creative with the way that we teach, and as we've learned more about adult learning and how people learn, you can be more interactive, which should result in more long-term retention of material. You can even, in the flipped classroom model, pre-assign some of the objectives as homework that will be done prior to class. Maybe for learning objective number 2, you want to go through a series of cases and review them in class together. You may decide that your third learning objective is best served by being taught with a didactic session about it. The other important piece to think about is that each of your learning objectives should also be testable. You want to be able to assess whether or not your learners have achieved that objective. And again, you can be creative with this. You don't have to test everyone for every teaching session that you give, but you should write your learning objectives and plan your teaching in such a way that you would be able to test whether or not your students have achieved that objective. Now, some tips for writing them. Here are some nuts and bolts to remember. For each learning objective, you want to assign them a specific task, and you want to use an action verb, something from Bloom's taxonomy that clearly tells the learner what you want them to be able to do. Make sure your objective is measurable. Can you test that they have succeeded? People commonly write learning objectives starting with the word understand. It's very hard to test if someone understands something or if someone has become familiar with something, whereas it's very easy to test if somebody can identify something. Make sure your objective is attainable with regard to the time frame. Think about how long you have for your teaching session and make sure that you haven't asked the learners to do more than is achievable in that time frame. Make sure the objective is relevant and important and meaningful for the learner to achieve. And make sure it's targeted to the desired level of learning. In other words, do you have introductory basic level learners, or you may be teaching fellows or practicing physicians who are more sophisticated in their learning. So when you actually sit down to write these, you want to finish the sentence. At the end of the session, the learner should be able to blank, and you want to insert an action verb from Bloom's. Now when you're sitting down to write these, sometimes it can be hard to think of these action verbs, but if you simply Google Bloom's taxonomy, there are a whole variety of different tables out there. This is one of the ones that I prefer because it's nice and clear. And for each level of cognitive skill, there are a variety of different action verbs that you can use as you write your learning objectives. If applicable, include the setting. You want to say whether you want them to be able to do something on a standardized patient or during a breast biopsy or identify a finding on a chest radiograph. You want to be as specific as possible so it's clear to the learner what you expect of them. One learning objective I recently came across was recognize and categorize renal masses. Now that's a little bit broad because you don't know if the learner is supposed to recognize and categorize them on ultrasound, or is it CT, or is it MRI? Should they be able to categorize them based on their level of aggressiveness or benignity? So make sure that the setting is very clear so the learning is implicit. Once you've written them, critique your own learning objectives. Are they clear enough? Review the radiography of hip trauma. I actually don't like the term review because I think it's a bit vague. You can review something, you can read through it time and time again, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've learned it or that you know it. So something clearer might be identify the radiographic findings of hip trauma or describe the radiographic findings of hip trauma. So make sure they're nice and clear. Are your learning objectives attainable? Back to the recognize and categorize renal masses, that was a learning objective. That was one of 5 learning objectives that were written for a 1-hour lecture. Now that's certainly not achievable in the allotted time frame. Are they targeted appropriately to the learner group? For a first-year gross anatomy class, you may have a lot of your learning objectives that come from the base of Bloom's pyramid, from the knowledge and comprehension level. However, if you are teaching a group of practicing physicians at a CME conference, you might want more of your learning objectives to come from higher levels on Bloom's taxonomy. And lastly, are they valid? Are they important? Are they meaningful? By achieving the learning objective you've established, has the trainee acquired a skill that really matters to them and to their future? Here's an example of what I mean. I came across this learning objective, list the risks of radiography. And at first glance, it sounds like that's an important thing to do. List is from the basic level of Bloom's taxonomy. It's a relatively simple skill. But what we probably would want our learners to be able to do is discuss the risks of radiography with a patient, or maybe discuss the risks and benefits of radiography with other providers. So make sure that what you're asking them to do is important for their future and for their level of training. So in summary, you just have to remember 5 things. Number 1, think about what you want your learners to know. Keep the focus on them and their education. Second, write down what you want them to know in the form of the learning objectives. Critique the learning objectives. Use those learning objectives to plan the session. And lastly, make sure that each of the learning objectives can be assessed. So in this way, you'll notice that the learning objectives are really central to the process of good instructional design. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.